Welcome back to another instalment of Up Close with QP. We have here today the Habring2 Chrono-Felix. This is the latest watch from Austrian husband and wife company Habring2, and it's a hand-wound monopusher chronograph with an in-house movement. It's called the Chrono-Felix because it's based on the Felix, Habring's entry-level model that saw the debut of their in-house caliber back in 2015. Since then, they've produced a split-seconds chronograph, the Doppel-Felix, and now we have this, the simpler version. Well, simple is still a relative term. There are improvements all over the movement. We'll get into that in a bit more detail later on. Habring's signature style is extremely restrained. It's very simple in concept, if not execution. For example, this case is about as archetypal as a watch case can be. But minimalist design isn't necessarily easy, and this is good. You look at things like the length of the hands relative to the placement of the hour markers, the relative length of the hour and minute hands to each other, the slight curvature to the tips of the second and minute hands, all those kind of things. There's an attention to detail across the watch that you just don't see on first glance. It's for a chronograph, it's incredibly sparse, very instrumental style to it, but also just very basic. It reminds me somewhat of vintage Longines, vintage Patek Philippe, but sort of via mid-century modern, sort of more Germanic design schools. The telephone call markers on the minute subdial are a nice touch. Again, another throwback to chronograph history. In terms of the case design, it's the same basic case as found on the Felix. So it's 39.5 millimeters across, and the bezel is relatively broad. There's not an enormous amount of sort of fine detailing or subtlety to the case, but you have nice crisp lines, a very, very subtle brushing to the case band. The one thing I like is that in profile you can just see there's a sort of slight lip about a millimeter high, which raises up from the bezel before the sapphire meets it, which just gives the whole thing a little bit more shape. And like I said, I think something you have to get used to about this watch is that there's just very little adornment. There's no lettering on the crown, for example, nothing on the case back. There's nothing to say limited edition or Habring. It's unnecessary. The movement's really the big story here. It uses Habring's A11 base, which is in theory derived from the ETA 7750, but doesn't actually use any components produced by ETA. Habring have made a lot of improvements to the movement design, and generally just elevated that workhorse chronograph movement to a degree that's not seen anywhere else. Things like the operating lever for the chronograph, the cam for the chronograph itself, are completely redone to make it that much more precise, that much sharper, and you see that in the way it actually operates. It's crisper and it's sharper again than using a 7750. Obviously it's hand wound, which is wonderful because you get a full view of the movement. The movement takes up the full width of the case. You can tell the whole thing's been thought through properly. It's a wonderful movement to watch in operation. Like I said, that unusual shaped cam, which is picked out again in an anodized blue finish, is a real joy to watch. It's also, following the redesign work that Habring have done, it's also a very, very different thing to look at. You would, at a glance, wouldn't pick it out as having that movement as its base. You've got a really unusual set of bridge shapes on the top here, and some nice contrast between these sort of blued screw heads, that blue cam, and the finishing given everywhere else. On the subject of the finishing, I found myself a little bit conflicted. Now, at first, picking this watch up, I don't think you notice sort of how good this is, what's going on here, because there's something a little bit sort of, dare I say, industrial. I don't mean it's not fine, but there's something a little bit industrial about the perlage, about the brushing, and actually even the beveling to these bridges. It's so fine, you don't notice there's beveling there at all until you've looked at it really close up, preferably with a loupe. That kind of detracted from me for the whole thing. On the wrist, I find the size pretty perfect. My wrist is a little bit under 7 inches round. This is a 39.5 millimeter case, and I think that's just absolutely spot on. There's a nice weight to the watch as well, and it fits under the shirt cuff. It passes that test. Operating the chronograph, as we mentioned already, is a treat. There's something nice and old school. When you have it off your wrist, that top pusher just falls very naturally where your thumb is, and it feels like you're using an old-fashioned stopwatch. I think that's a really neat touch. Obviously this is a monopusher, so there's no start, stop, restart. It's always start, stop, reset. Other points, I like to see quick release bars on the straps, because this for me would work really well with some sort of canvas. I don't think the layout of it would really take a NATO so well, but textile or canvas straps, or even just different colour leather, could really give it a new lease of life a couple of years down the line. The thing that I think really does it for me, and if you didn't know Habring Squared, if you didn't know them at all as a brand and you came across the watch, this is, for me, this is what it would be like if Nomos, one of my other favourite brands, made a chronograph. And I've been on at Nomos to make a chronograph for years. They don't listen to me, which, you know, is probably sensible in the long term. But if you are a Nomos fan and you've always wanted a chronograph, this, I think, ticks that box, as well as, of course, just being a really standout chronograph on its own merits.